My name is Megan, and that night, I decided to go shopping late. Something I usually do when I want to avoid the rush and chaos of the stores during the day. Walmart was almost empty, just the way I like it. Walking through the silent aisles gave me time to think, reflect on the day, and organize my thoughts. I like the calm I find there, away from the crowds and noise. I took my cart and started going through the sections, focused on my shopping list. As I pushed the cart through the aisles, my mind wandered, and I hardly paid attention to the few people around me. The shelves were well organized, and I appreciated the tranquility of the moment. The atmosphere was pleasant, and I felt at peace. The shopping list was simple, just some essentials for the week, nothing out of the ordinary. Everything was going well, just like any other night I went shopping late. Then, as I turned down an aisle, I noticed something that caught my attention. A man whom I hadn't noticed before was standing near a shelf, seemingly looking at the products. I didn't pay much attention, but I felt a slight discomfort when I realized he was alone and seemed to be watching me. I continued with my shopping, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling, but something told me to stay alert. As I changed aisles, I began to notice that the man was always nearby. He didn't make direct contact, but maintained a certain distance, as if he was discreetly following me. The discomfort grew, and I began to feel a bit apprehensive. There was no one else around, and the fact that he was always in my line of sight made me nervous. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the feeling that something wasn't right lingered. Over the next few minutes, I continued my route through the supermarket sections, but now with an increasing awareness of the man's presence. He never came too close, but he also never completely disappeared. Every time I changed sections, he was there, always maintaining that strange distance. What was once a peaceful night of shopping began to turn into something more disturbing, and I knew I needed to finish my shopping as quickly as possible. I decided to ignore him and focus on my shopping list, but it was difficult. Every time I picked an item from the shelf, I could feel his heavy gaze on me, like an invisible presence that made me shiver. I tried to shake off the feeling, but everything worsened when, as I changed aisles, he passed by me sideways and flashed a disturbing smirk, his eyes lingering on mine a second longer than necessary. My stomach turned, and at that moment, the idea that he might be toying with me became impossible to ignore. The feeling of being followed became unbearable. The store, which had been a safe and peaceful place, now seemed full of invisible threats. The man said nothing, made no explicit gestures, but his presence was suffocating. I began to question if I was imagining things, if fear was making me see danger where there was none. But with each new encounter with him, that doubt dissipated, giving way to a growing certainty that something was wrong. I decided that I could not continue to ignore the situation. The discomfort had turned into fear, and I knew I needed to do something. But what? Asking someone in the store for help seemed like an exaggeration, as he hadn't done anything concrete. Yet the idea of confronting him was terrifying. I was caught between the need to act and the fear of making things worse. Every minute that passed made me more nervous, and the thought of quickly finishing my shopping began to dominate my mind. I knew I needed to get out of there as soon as possible, but the fear that he might follow me to the car left me paralyzed for a moment. I looked around, trying to assess my options. The store was almost empty, and the few employees I saw were distant, busy with their tasks. The only thing I could do was continue, hoping he would leave or that somehow I could lose him. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be easy. Determined to test whether I was really being followed, I began to change sections more frequently. My plan was simple. If he didn't appear in one or two sections, I would know I might just be imagining things. But if he continued to follow me, then I would have to find a way to leave the store safely. With this strategy in mind, I turned the cart and headed to the gardening section, a place I normally wouldn't visit. When I reached the gardening section, I stopped for a few moments, pretending to be interested in the products. My heart pounded as I waited to see if the man would reappear. For a moment I thought I might have managed to lose him. But when I turned to continue my shopping, there he was, standing at the entrance of the section, pretending to look at gardening tools. The certainty that he was following me was now undeniable. What might have been a coincidence now seemed like a deliberate pursuit. I changed sections again, this time heading to the electronics area, hoping he would tire or give up. But once again he appeared, always maintaining the same distance, always watching. The store, which had been a safe place, now felt like a labyrinth from which I couldn't escape. Each change of section was a desperate attempt to get rid of him, but with every new move he was there, like a constant shadow. The tension increased with every step I took, and the fear that he might be waiting for the right moment to do something left me paralyzed. I tried to remain calm, but the feeling of being cornered was starting to overwhelm me. Finally, I decided that I could no longer continue trying to lose him. I needed to finish my shopping quickly and leave the store before things got worse. The idea that he might follow me to the parking lot terrified me, but I knew that the longer I stayed in the store, the more dangerous the situation would become. I took a deep breath and began to grab the remaining items on my list, trying to ignore the fear that was sinking deeper and deeper inside me. My mind was focused on one thing: leaving the store as quickly as possible. However, at every shelf I visited, the strange man was always nearby. He never came too close, but his presence was constant, as if he were waiting for something. The sense of urgency grew, and my heart raced faster with every minute. Every movement I made was accompanied by the awareness that he was there, watching. The initial discomfort had turned into real, almost palpable fear. The idea of confronting him crossed my mind, but the terror that it might trigger something worse made me give up. Instead, I hurried my steps, grabbing items almost mechanically without even checking if they were exactly what I needed. My only concern was to get out of there before he had the chance to do something. The store, which had seemed spacious and tranquil, now felt as if it were closing in on me. Each aisle became a potential trap, and every second that passed seemed to increase the danger. The cart, which had been just a tool to carry my purchases, now felt like an obstacle preventing me from leaving quickly. I felt vulnerable, exposed, and the fact that he was always nearby only made the situation worse. Finally, with all the items I needed in the cart, I headed to the checkout. The line was almost empty, just one person ahead of me. Apparently, I was about to escape that horrible situation. However, when I looked back, I saw that the strange man was also approaching, joining the same line as me. He was closer than before, and the disturbing smile on his face made my heart skip a beat. His proximity while I waited in line was unbearable. I could feel his eyes on me, and the fear left me paralyzed. I tried to focus on the simple task of paying for my purchases, but the panic grew with every second. The smile on his face was a silent threat, and the sense of imminent danger was overwhelming. I knew I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible, but at the same time, the idea that he might follow me to the parking lot filled me with dread. The strange man was right behind me, so close that I could feel his presence before even seeing him. The disturbing smile on his face, now even more evident, sent me into a panic. I tried to focus on my purchases, scanning the items through the checkout as quickly as possible, but the awareness that he was there, so close, made every second feel like an eternity. While the cashier was ringing up my purchases, my heart raced so fast I could barely think straight. I needed to get out of there, but every move he made seemed to increase my sense of danger. He didn't say a word, but his closeness was suffocating. The smile never left his face, and I knew he was reveling in my fear. All I wanted was to leave the store and run, but it felt like time was conspiring against me. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the cashier finished scanning all the items and asked me to pay. My hands trembled as I tried to swipe my card, but the simple act of inserting the chip in the machine seemed impossible at that moment. Every second it took to complete the transaction was a second longer I spent near him. The panic grew, and the sensation of being in a trap was almost unbearable. After finally paying, I grabbed my bags and prepared to leave as quickly as possible. But before I could get away, the man stepped forward, closing the distance even more. He said nothing, but the look he gave me was enough to send a chill down my spine. My entire body was tense, ready to run, but I knew I had to maintain my composure until I was out of the store. Any rash movement could trigger something I was not prepared to face. I walked away from the checkout quickly, feeling a momentary relief at being out of his immediate proximity. However, the fear was still there, like a shadow I couldn't shake off. I knew he might follow me to the parking lot, and the thought of being alone out there with him terrified me. Nevertheless, I knew I had to leave the store no matter the cost. I took a deep breath and prepared for whatever came next. As soon as I left the checkout, I walked as fast as I could toward the exit of Walmart. The relief of finally being out of the store was brief, replaced almost immediately by a new wave of panic when I realized that the strange man was also leaving. He hadn't bought anything, and the fact that he was following me to the parking lot made my heart race even more. The fear of being alone with him out there was overwhelming, but I had no choice but to continue. As I passed through the automatic doors, the night air enveloped me, but the sense of danger didn't disappear. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few cars scattered about, and the dim lights created shadows that seemed to move with the breeze. I knew where my car was parked, and all I wanted was to reach it as quickly as possible. However, the awareness that he was right behind me made every step a monumental effort. I looked around, trying to find an exit or help, but the parking lot was deserted. The silence was broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and his footsteps behind me. Each sound seemed amplified, as if the world had been reduced to this moment of tension. The distance between us was not large, but it was enough for me to feel that he was always lurking, ready to act at any moment. When I finally saw my car, relief began to dawn, but it was short-lived. The awareness that he was so close, and that I was about to enter a confined and vulnerable space made me hesitate. I looked back for a moment and saw that he had stopped, just watching me with that disturbing smile. The panic intensified, and I felt as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. Without another option, I decided to hurry. I approached the car, feeling adrenaline take over my body. Every second seemed crucial, and the idea that he could do something at any moment pushed me to action. However, when I reached the car door and put my hand in my bag to get the keys, panic took hold of me completely. The keys were not where I thought they were. I had lost them, and now I was completely vulnerable. The sensation of panic took over me as soon as I realized that the keys were not in my bag. I rummaged through it desperately, trying to find the keys, but without success. My heart was beating so hard it seemed it would burst. I looked around trying to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. I knew he was approaching, and time was running out. Each second without the keys made me more desperate, and the feeling of vulnerability was crushing. I was paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do. The idea that he was slowly approaching, unhurried, as if he knew I had nowhere to go, was terrifying. The shadows around seemed to close in on me, and the sound of his steps, getting closer, was the only thing I could hear. The world around me seemed to have shrunk, leaving just me and him in this space of dread and despair. Finally, I looked up and saw him a few meters away, his disturbing smile more evident than ever. He paused for a moment, watching my reaction, as if he was savoring my panic. The idea that he was enjoying this at my expense filled me with terror, and my mind began to race for a solution. I knew I needed to get out of there, but without the keys, I was trapped. I looked around one more time, hoping to find someone, anyone who could help, but the parking lot remained deserted. There was no one around, and the fear that he might be planning something terrible dominated me completely. The dim lights of the parking lot cast long, threatening shadows, and the idea of being alone with him there without any way to escape left me in complete despair. He took another step forward, getting even closer. My breathing became ragged, and I knew time was running out. I was at his mercy, and the idea that he could do anything was terrifying. I knew I needed to act, but the panic paralyzed me, and I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Then he reached out, holding something that glinted in the dim light. My keys. But the smile on his face made it clear that his intentions were far more sinister. Finally, I took a deep breath and decided to act. I reached out my trembling hand to take the keys, keeping my eyes fixed on him, ready for anything. But before I could reach them, he pulled the keys back, his smile widening even more. The gesture, though small, was enough to make me realize that he was playing with me, that all of this was a game to him. Despair turned into desperation, and I knew I needed to get out of there by any means necessary. I was completely immobile, panic taking hold of me, when he leaned a little closer and whispered in a low, threatening voice, "Did you know it's dangerous to shop alone at this hour?" The shock ran through my body, leaving me even more terrified. He was clearly trying to frighten me, and his words hit home. With the smile still on his lips, he extended the keys once again, forcing me to take them. Trembling, I reached out and took the keys, feeling the cold metal against my sweaty skin. But he didn't move. He stood there, watching me with that fixed gaze, as if waiting to see what I would do next. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, he continued there, motionless, keeping his gaze fixed on me. My mind screamed for me to run, to get out of there as fast as possible, but my body felt glued to the ground by fear. Finally, I managed to gather the strength to turn and walk towards the car. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it pulsing in my ears. As I walked away, I felt his eyes on my back, like a menacing presence I couldn't shake off. I opened the car door with trembling hands and threw myself into the seat along with my purchases, immediately locking the doors. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that he was still there, standing in the same spot, watching. The disturbing smile had finally disappeared, replaced by a blank expression that left me even more uneasy. I started the car quickly, trying not to look at him again, and drove out of the parking lot as fast as I could. But the terror I felt that night would haunt me for a long time. Even after leaving the parking lot and being away from that man, my mind couldn't stop spinning with disturbing questions. Why did he follow me? What did he really want? And why did he make a point of scaring me that way, whispering those words? Every detail of that night, from the sinister look to the disturbing smile, kept replaying in my head. Did he know where I lived? Was I in danger again? The sense of security I had when doing something as simple as nighttime shopping was completely destroyed, and the doubt about his intentions left me with a fear that seemed endless. My name is Ryan, and that night I was on duty as a security camera operator at Walmart. It was a quiet night, like many others I had spent, and the store was nearly empty. The routine was the same: monitor the cameras, ensure everything was in order, and that nothing out of the ordinary occurred. The screens in front of me showed different angles of the store, from the main entrance to the more remote aisles. The work was monotonous, but I was used to it. As the hours passed, I allowed myself to relax a bit in the chair. The flow of customers was almost non-existent, and the store was enveloped in a silence only occasionally broken by the sounds of cameras shifting angles. I watched the footage attentively, but everything seemed to be in perfect order. The shelves were organized, the aisles empty, and the tranquility of the night stretched throughout the store. It was exactly the kind of night I expected, uneventful and problem-free. While watching the screens, my thoughts began to wander, and I found myself thinking about how the night shift was usually predictable. The only true moments of tension came when something deviated from the norm, but that rarely happened. That night, I wasn't expecting anything different. However, it was exactly at that moment that I noticed something strange on one of the cameras. A quick movement, almost imperceptible, in the footage from the storage area, where no one should have been. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or a glitch in the cameras, but I continued watching, curious. The movement repeated, this time more clearly. It looked like a figure moving swiftly, but the image quality wasn't good enough to clearly identify what it was. My heart started to beat a little faster as I tried to understand what was happening. The tranquility of the night had been interrupted, and I knew I needed to pay more attention. I decided to monitor that area more closely, adjusting the cameras to try and get a better view. But as soon as I focused on one spot, the figure disappeared. It was as if it was avoiding the cameras, moving to areas that weren't covered by the angles I had available. A sense of discomfort began to grow within me, but I was still not sure what I was seeing. Perhaps it was just my imagination playing tricks, but something told me there was more behind those images. I continued to monitor the cameras, more alert to what might be happening. The tranquility of the night had been replaced by growing tension as I looked for more signs of movement. The figure I had seen before continued to appear sporadically in the footage, always in areas where there should be no one. Each time I tried to focus on it, the figure disappeared, as if it knew exactly where the cameras were positioned. The discomfort inside me grew with each appearance of the figure. What was initially curiosity now turned into a subtle but persistent fear. The store was technically closed to the public in various areas, so there was no reason for anyone to be there, especially at that hour. I began to review recordings from the last few hours, trying to find any clue that might explain the presence of that figure, but I found nothing useful. As I continued to observe, the figure appeared again, moving quickly among the shelves in the storage area. This time it seemed clearer, yet still indistinct, as if out of focus. I adjusted the cameras once more, trying to follow it, but it disappeared into a blind spot in the footage. A feeling of helplessness overwhelmed me for a moment, and I knew I needed to find out what was going on. The idea that something or someone was playing with me began to form in my mind. I started to feel that the control room, where I normally felt safe and isolated, was becoming a place of increasing tension. The sound of the cameras turning seemed louder than usual, and the silence of the store, which was once comforting, now left me restless. With each new suspicious movement I saw on the screens, the sense that something was very wrong only grew. I decided that if I couldn't identify the figure on the cameras, I would have to check it out in person. The decision to leave the control room wasn't easy. I knew that once outside, I would be more vulnerable, but I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. I needed to understand what was happening before the situation got out of hand. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and prepared to investigate in person. I grabbed a flashlight and a communication radio, aware that once outside the room, the only thing that would keep me in contact with the rest of the team would be that radio. I left the control room with the flashlight in hand, the radio clipped to my belt, and my heart beating faster than I would like to admit. The store, which had previously seemed calm and familiar, now had an air of mystery and danger. Every aisle I walked through seemed full of shadows and threatening possibilities. I started in the area where I had last seen the figure on the cameras, moving cautiously, trying not to make noise. The flashlight illuminated the path ahead, but the shadows it created seemed more threatening than I had imagined. Every little noise, no matter how slight, made my heart jump. The oppressive silence of the store was only interrupted by the sound of my footsteps and the occasional interference on the radio. I was completely focused on finding any sign of movement, but the figure I had seen before seemed to have completely disappeared. I continued to check the areas where the cameras had shown the figure, trying to find any clue. But with each new attempt, I ended up in empty aisles and silent shelves. The discomfort turned into frustration and a growing fear that I was being played in a game I couldn't win. The figure seemed to move with a skill I couldn't match, always one step ahead, always out of reach. I tried to adjust my approach, moving faster and less predictably, but nothing seemed to work. The figure remained elusive, appearing only in the blind spots of the cameras or disappearing before I could reach it. The feeling of being manipulated by something or someone grew, and I couldn't help feeling that I was at a disadvantage. I knew I needed to keep going, but the fear of dealing with something unknown and dangerous began to consume me. Finally, after an unsuccessful search, I decided it was time to return to the control room. Maybe from there, I could find a pattern in the movements of the figure, or at least understand better what was happening. The idea of returning to the safety of the control room was comforting, but it also carried a weight. I didn't want to admit I was running away, but the truth was that the tension was becoming unbearable. I needed a new strategy, something that would give me an advantage over whatever was stalking me. Returning to the control room, I decided I needed to be more methodical in my investigation. I mentally reviewed each move I had made and each area I had checked. I knew there was something or someone there, but the elusive nature of that presence was making me increasingly restless. I decided to start with the areas not covered by the cameras, the so-called blind spots. These places might hold the key to solving the mystery, and I needed to confront them head-on. I walked through the aisles with the flashlight, checking every dark corner, every space between the shelves, trying to find any sign of activity. The silence of the store seemed denser now, and the darkness in poorly lit corners was oppressive. I moved slowly, each step measured, with my eyes alert for any movement. But no matter how much I searched, the mysterious figure did not appear. It was as if it knew exactly where I was, avoiding my efforts to find it. With each new area I investigated, the frustration grew. It seemed like I was always a step behind, as if the intruder was anticipating each of my moves. I checked the less frequented areas, where someone's presence would be easier to notice, but everything was in order. The shelves were intact, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. The feeling of being deceived was overwhelming, and I began to doubt my own sanity. Then I noticed something that made me even more nervous. The cameras, which were supposed to cover nearly the entire store, left several blind areas, creating zones of total darkness where anything could be happening without my knowledge. These areas, usually ignored because they were considered safe, now seemed to hide invisible dangers. I decided I needed to explore these blind spots, even if that meant facing whatever was hiding there. With the flashlight in hand, I began to investigate the blind spots, moving with as much caution as possible. I knew that once inside these spaces, I would be completely alone, without the protection of the cameras. The fear was palpable, but I couldn't back down. I needed to discover the truth, no matter how much it terrified me. As I approached the electronics section, one of the camera's blind spots, a chill ran down my spine. It was a place that would normally be busy during the day, but now, at night, it was enveloped in an unsettling quiet. I used the flashlight to illuminate the aisle, observing each shelf and each corner, looking for any sign of movement. That's when I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. One of the security cameras was pointed towards the floor. The sight of the out-of-position camera made my heart race. That was a clear sign that someone had been there, someone who knew exactly how to avoid being seen. I approached the camera, trying to correct its position, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Each second I spent there, trying to adjust the camera, seemed to increase the tension in the air. The silence around me became oppressive, and the fear that something could happen at any moment was almost unbearable. I looked around, trying to find any clue as to who might have done that, but the place was empty, with no sign of recent activity. The absence of any other human presence made the environment seem even more threatening. Each shadow, each reflection on the electronic screens seemed to move subtly, as if it were watching me. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming, and I began to question my decision to investigate personally. While struggling against the growing fear, I forced myself to continue the search. I adjusted the camera back to its original position, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The darkness in the corners of the electronics section seemed to be closing in on me, and the idea that something or someone might be hiding there left me panicked. I needed to get out of that section as quickly as possible, but curiosity and duty to find out what was happening kept me there. Finally, I decided there was nothing more to be found there. Returning to the control room seemed to be the only safe option at that moment. The idea of reviewing the footage again, from a place where I could observe everything without being exposed, was comforting. However, the fear that something was wrong, that I was being followed without realizing it, was always present. With the flashlight still trembling in my hand, I began to walk back to the control room, trying to calm my shaken nerves. The walk back to the control room seemed longer than usual. Every corridor I passed through was enveloped in a disturbing darkness, and the silence of the store was almost deafening. Finally, I reached the door to the control room, feeling immediate relief as I entered and locked the door behind me. The familiar space with its screens and monitors provided a sense of security, but the fear that something might be happening in the shadows continued to haunt me. I sat down in the chair in front of the monitors, adjusting the cameras to review the footage of the areas I had just investigated. I hoped to find some clue, something that would give me an idea of what was happening. As I progressed through the recordings, I saw myself walking through the aisles, the flashlight illuminating the path ahead of me. Everything seemed normal, until something caught my attention. A shadowy figure appeared in the recordings, walking right behind me. My heart raced as I saw the figure in the footage. It was so close to me, but I hadn't noticed anything while I was out there. The figure moved with a chilling calm, always maintaining a certain distance, but clearly following me. Panic took hold of me, and I began to review the recordings frantically, trying to understand how this was possible. How could someone have been so close without me noticing? The feeling of being watched intensified as I watched the footage. The figure disappeared and reappeared in the blind spots of the cameras, as if it were playing with me, avoiding being fully captured. The terror of something following me without my realizing it was overwhelming. The safe space of the control room now seemed like a place of vulnerability, where anything could happen. Finally, I stopped reviewing the footage, unable to bear what I was seeing. I needed a break, some time to process what I had just witnessed. The control room, which had once been a safe haven, now felt oppressive. I got up from the chair, trying to shake off the growing panic, and decided to go to the break room to get some coffee. Maybe a little distance would help me think more clearly about what was happening. I walked through the almost empty corridors, hearing the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the floor. The silence of the store at night, which had once given me a sense of peace, now seemed laden with tension. I reached the break room and began preparing the coffee, trying to calm my nerves. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee brought me a brief moment of relief, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning with the images I had seen. While drinking the coffee, I tried to organize my thoughts. The figure in the recordings, which had passed so close to me without my noticing, seemed impossible to explain. Was someone playing with me? Or could it be something more sinister? The idea of returning to the control room gave me chills, but I knew I needed to understand what was happening. I couldn't simply ignore what I had seen. After finishing the coffee, I took a deep breath and decided to return to the control room. The corridor seemed longer and darker than before, and each step I took was accompanied by a growing sense of unease. I was almost at the door to the control room when I heard a noise coming from inside. It was a soft sound, like something moving, but it was enough to make me stop immediately. My heart began to beat faster. I stood still for a moment, trying to listen more carefully. The sound seemed to come from inside the control room, which made the panic rise within me. I hesitated, but I knew I needed to check what was happening. With the flashlight in hand, I slowly pushed open the door to the control room, fearing what I might find on the other side. Chapter 8. The Conclusion. As I opened the door to the control room, a chill ran down my spine. The room was almost as I had left it, but something was different. The silence was oppressive, and a slight movement caught my attention. The chair, which had been stationary, was now slowly spinning in the center of the room, as if someone had just gotten up from it. Panic took hold of me, and the idea that someone or something was there, invisible, left me paralyzed. My mind was in complete chaos. Had someone entered while I was out? And if the figure I saw in the recordings was there, watching me all the time? Every second I spent in the room increased the dread I felt. I looked around, trying to find any sign that something was out of place, but I saw nothing beyond the slowly spinning chair. The sound I had heard earlier seemed to have disappeared, leaving only absolute silence. Finally, I gathered the courage to take a few steps forward, my heart racing and the flashlight trembling in my hands. I illuminated the dark corners of the room but found nothing. The chair stopped spinning, but the feeling that I was not alone remained. The air was heavy, as if something invisible was about to reveal itself. The only thing left was fear, a deep and irrational fear that left me without reaction. The dread that something could happen at any moment kept me immobile. I could no longer trust my senses, not knowing if I was truly alone or if something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to act. The control room, which had once been a safe place, now seemed like a trap, and I couldn't escape. The sound of my own heart beating was the only thing that broke the deadly silence. Trapped in that nightmare, I felt that there was no way out. Fear took complete control of me, and the only thing I could do was wait, in a state of absolute panic for whatever was to come. The invisible terror that surrounded me was overwhelming, and the feeling of being watched, but unable to see the watcher, left me on the brink of despair. At that moment, I realized that I was trapped in my own mind, unsure if I could escape the horror that seemed to have no end. My name is John, and I work the night shift at a Walmart, a routine that, until now, had always felt calm. The silence of the store during the early morning hours used to be a refuge where I could perform my tasks at my own pace, alone with my thoughts. That night, like so many others, I started my rounds through the more isolated sections, certain it would be just another ordinary night. Little did I know that something strange was about to happen, something that would forever change the way I viewed the night shift. As I walked down the aisles, I felt a slight unease that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the accumulated fatigue, or simply the lack of activity during the night, but something felt different. I continued my rounds, checking each aisle, organizing the products, and making sure everything was in order. The sound of the ventilation system echoed softly through the store, occasionally interrupting the deep silence. As the hours passed, I began to settle into the monotony of the shift. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and the store was as quiet as always. However, the feeling of unease lingered, a small shadow in the back of my mind that I tried to ignore. Maybe it was just my imagination, I thought, trying to dismiss any notion that something could be wrong. After all, it was just a few more hours until the end of my shift. The store was large and empty, and I knew it was unlikely that anything disturbing would happen. Still, the sense that I was being watched began to grow. There was no reason to feel afraid, but the absolute silence of the store, once so familiar, now felt heavier. I tried to focus on my tasks, pushing away any irrational thoughts, but the discomfort wouldn't go away. The long hours of the night shift could affect the mind in strange ways. I decided to carry on with my routine, ignoring the slight sense of unease forming within me. After all, it was just another night like so many others, and I was determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. As I walked through the aisles, something caught my attention. The lights in some aisles started to flicker. At first, I didn't think much of it. Electrical issues weren't uncommon, especially in a building as large and old as this one. I continued my rounds, hoping the lights would stabilize on their own. However, as I got closer to certain aisles, the flickering became more frequent. The lights flickered irregularly, creating shadows that danced across the shelves and aisles. The effect was unsettling, but I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a technical problem. However, the more the lights flickered, the more uncomfortable I felt. Every time I tried to ignore it, the flickering seemed to intensify, as if it were responding to my presence. I began to avoid the aisles where the lights were flickering, moving to the sections where the lighting was still stable. However, this strategy soon proved useless, as the flickering seemed to follow me, spreading to other areas of the store. The sense of unease grew with every minute, but I tried to stay focused on my tasks, organizing the shelves and checking the stock. Finally, I reached a point where I could no longer ignore what was happening. The lights were flickering so intensely that it was hard to see what was in front of me. The discomfort gave way to genuine concern. Something wasn't right, and I could no longer pretend it was just a technical issue. I decided that if the lights continued to flicker, I would need to report the problem to maintenance as soon as my shift ended. But before I could think of a solution, a disturbing thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't just a technical problem? What if something else was happening in the store? The idea seemed absurd, but I couldn't shake it. I continued walking through the aisles, trying to ignore the flickering lights and the growing feeling that something was watching me. As I continued my rounds, something even stranger began to happen. I started to notice that some objects were out of place, as if someone had moved them. Shelves that I knew were organized now seemed disheveled, with products misaligned or even fallen on the floor. At first, I thought maybe I had left something out of place myself, but soon I realized it was more than that. The feeling that someone or something was messing with the shelves began to make me nervous. The store was supposed to be empty, except for me, and it didn't make sense for objects to be out of place. I decided I needed to check if someone was in the store without my knowledge. I began to pay more attention to my surroundings, looking for any sign of movement or activity that could explain what was happening. As I walked, I found more and more items out of place. A can of soup on the floor, cereal boxes stacked strangely, even children's toys scattered on a shelf that was usually immaculate. All of this worried me even more. It was as if someone had been passing through, tampering with everything without bothering to be discreet. The idea that I wasn't alone in the store began to solidify in my mind. I decided it was time to investigate more deeply. If someone was in the store, I needed to know. I walked through aisles I hadn't yet covered that night, hoping to find some clue about what was going on. However, with each step I took, the feeling that something was wrong only intensified. The silence, once comforting, now seemed like a harbinger of something sinister. As I inspected one of the shelves, I realized that the feeling of being watched had intensified. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but I saw nothing but disorganized shelves and flickering lights. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time that night, I began to consider the possibility that something very wrong was happening there. I decided I needed to be more cautious, but at the same time, something inside me wanted to discover the truth. As I continued my rounds, my mind was occupied with what could be causing these changes in the store. Then I started hearing strange sounds, which made the situation even more disturbing. At first, they were just small noises, almost imperceptible. The sound of something scraping on the floor, a faint, distant tapping, and occasionally the sound of something falling in another aisle. What bothered me the most was that each sound seemed to come from a different place, as if something was moving through the store. At first, I tried to rationalize the sounds. Maybe it was just the ventilation systems or some small animal that had entered the store. Nothing to worry about. But the frequency of the sounds and the way they seemed to follow my footsteps made me increasingly tense. I could no longer ignore that something was wrong. I decided I needed to investigate each sound, a task I performed with growing apprehension. Whenever I tried to follow one of the sounds, it seemed to move away, as if it were avoiding me. I would approach an aisle where I heard a noise, but when I got there, everything was silent. The situation repeated itself several times, with the sounds always leading me to empty places. The store, once a familiar and safe space, now felt like a labyrinth full of invisible dangers. I began to feel that I was being lured into some kind of trap. With each new sound, my imagination became more active, creating frightening scenarios about what could be happening. Maybe it was someone playing tricks on me or something worse. The fact that I found nothing where I expected to see the source of the sounds only heightened my nerves. I started walking faster, trying to cover more ground, but this only increased the intensity of the noises, as if they were feeding on my fear. Finally, after a long search for something I couldn't see, I decided I needed to get back to basics. Maybe if I reviewed the security cameras, I could find some clue that would explain what was going on. It was clear I wouldn't be able to solve the mystery just by following the sounds. I returned to the security room, hoping to find some sort of answer in the recordings. But even as I walked toward the room, the feeling that something was watching me persisted, making me question whether I really wanted to know what was behind all of this. I reached the security room with the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But instead of reviewing the cameras as usual, something in the back of my mind told me to do something different. I decided to take out my phone and use the flashlight to see the sections where the lights were flickering. But before leaving, something caught my attention on the monitors. There was an area of the store where the shelves reflected the light strangely, almost as if something was moving between them. My first thought was that maybe the lighting was causing a reflection effect, but the movement pattern was too deliberate, almost as if a figure was hiding in the shadows and moving from shelf to shelf. I decided to watch the reflections more carefully, hoping to catch any unusual movement. As I looked, I saw a reflection that made my blood run cold. Something was moving, but I couldn't clearly see what it was. It looked like a shadow, thin and fast, as if it were trying to avoid being seen. The reflection moved back and forth, disappearing at one point and reappearing at another. It was as if something was playing with me, sneaking around the shelves, knowing exactly where the cameras were positioned to avoid being captured directly. The discomfort increased as I realized that the movement pattern seemed to be circling me, as if it were watching me through the reflections. Fear began to mix with curiosity. I decided that I couldn't just keep watching, I had to investigate in person. I grabbed the flashlight and prepared to leave the security room. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and headed towards the aisles where I had seen the strange reflections. Each step felt heavier, as if the air around me was becoming denser. When I arrived at the place where the reflections were moving, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The lighting seemed normal, but the shelves, now bathed in the flashlight's beam, seemed more threatening, as if they were hiding something I couldn't see. I scanned the area with the flashlight, hoping to find anything that would explain the movements I had seen on the monitors, but everything seemed in order. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. As I continued my investigation, something more disturbing caught my attention. There were footprints on the floor. The marks were strange, as if someone had passed through there recently, but they were dark, almost soaked, as if made by wet feet. The discovery of the footprints was like a punch in the gut. Who else could be in the store at this hour, and why hadn't I noticed before? I followed the footprints with the flashlight, but every time I got close to where they should be, it seemed like they disappeared. It was as if whoever left them knew exactly how to avoid being caught, both by the cameras and by me. The terror that something was circling me, watching my every move, left me paralyzed for a moment. Still, I pressed on, determined to understand what was happening. As I followed the footprints, the strange reflections began to appear again on the shiny surfaces of the shelves and objects I was inspecting. It was as if the store itself was conspiring to confuse me, to make me question what was real. I felt that every step I took led me deeper into a maze of fear, where the answers I sought were increasingly out of reach. Finally, the footprints led to an aisle I knew to be a nearly deserted area of the store, where the lighting was dimmer. The sense of being watched became unbearable. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I was alone, but at the same time, I felt that something was there, waiting for me, hiding in the shadows and reflections. With the flashlight trembling in my hand, I continued following the footprints until they finally disappeared at a point where the aisle split in two. I was lost. Not physically, but mentally. In a game of cat and mouse with something I couldn't see clearly. The fear and frustration consumed me, but I knew I couldn't stop. I had to find out what was going on before it was too late. Following the path where the footprints disappeared, I entered the darkest aisle in the store. The air was colder there, as if something was draining the energy from the environment. Suddenly, the whispers began. They were low, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me freeze in place. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the shelves, distorting into something I couldn't understand but that filled me with dread. The sound was indescribable, somewhere between muffled conversation and distant crying. There was no logic to it, and the fear was turning into terror as I tried to understand where it was coming from. Finally, the whispers became more focused, seeming to come from a specific point in the aisle ahead of me. Fear told me to turn back, to run as fast as I could, but curiosity and the need for answers pushed me forward. As I moved forward, the whispers grew clearer, almost as if they were calling out to me. I felt a shiver run down my spine when I saw a shadow moving between the shelves, like a dark figure gliding across the floor. I pressed on, knowing I was approaching something I couldn't explain, something that defied logic. Then, at the end of the aisle, I saw a figure standing between the shelves. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was a coworker. Someone I knew should be home at that hour, resting. But there he was, standing there with an expression that made my blood run cold. His eyes were open but empty, as if he were in a trance. There was no life in his gaze, just a kind of disturbing void that seemed to suck all the light around him. He didn't move. He just stared at me with that strange expression, and the whispers I was hearing seemed to emanate from him. My mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. I tried to speak to him, to ask what he was doing there, but the words got stuck in my throat. The fear that he was no longer the person I knew, that something had taken over him, was overwhelming. And then, he began to move slowly toward me. I instinctively backed away, not knowing what to do. Each step he took toward me was accompanied by that empty, expressionless stare, like he was being controlled by something I couldn't see. The flashlight trembled in my hands, and the aisle seemed to narrow around us. The idea that I was trapped there with no visible way out terrified me. I tried to stay calm, but each time he got closer, the panic inside me grew. It wasn't just the fact that he was there, but the way he moved, almost like an automaton, without emotion or clear intention. It was as if I were facing a distorted version of someone I knew, a version that no longer had control over its actions. I began to retreat, keeping my eyes on him, trying to maintain a safe distance. But he kept getting closer, unhurried, as if he knew I had nowhere to go. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming, and the fear that he might do something unexpected paralyzed me. I felt I needed to act, to do something before he got too close. Then, in a moment of pure desperation, I turned and ran. I didn't know where to go. I just knew I needed to get out of there to find a safe place. I heard his footsteps behind me but didn't dare look back. The aisle seemed endless, and panic drove me forward, faster than I thought I could run. Finally, I reached the security room and threw myself inside, locking the door behind me. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath and understand what had just happened. But the fear that he was still out there waiting for me kept me on edge. I knew that whatever was controlling my coworker wasn't finished, and that the nightmare was far from over. I was trapped in a deadly game, and the only thing left was the uncertainty of what would happen next. Even after locking the security room door, doubts continued to haunt my mind like persistent shadows. What had really happened to my coworker? Was he possessed by something or someone? Or was it all just a cruel trick of my own mind? The feeling that something was still out there, waiting for me, left me restless, not knowing if I would ever escape the invisible terror that now inhabited the store's aisles.